With Starfield set to release in 2023, Bethesda's first new IP in 25 years is nearly here. However, it is not the company's first venture into the vast emptiness of space. The stars above us are fundamental to gaming. From the 70s arcade games of Asteroid and Space Invaders, to the variety of derivatives and evolutions that grew from those humble beginnings. Mankind's fascination with the vast universe beyond this planet knows no bounds. Bethesda Softworks had dipped their toes into this last frontier before with 1994's sci-fi space racer Delta V. Seeking to recreate the excitement of Star Wars' trench run, Delta V had gamers swooping through valleys and tunnels, avoiding obstacles as they raced to the finish. In spite of this exhilarating concept, Delta V, with its limited scope and suspect speed-killing design choices, was left with less than stellar reviews. But this didn't dissuade the team from attempting another space game. Company founder Christopher Weaver, having attended MIT, worked as a technology advisor for the US government. He was a master of networking, with connections all the way to Hollywood. Indeed, that is how this relatively small developer found itself in possession of the gaming rights to the Terminator franchise. Through these connections, Bethesda entered talks with Centropolis Entertainment, the production company behind the sci-fi epic Stargate. Founded by director Roland Emmerich, he and actor-turned-writer Dean Devlin approached Weaver, interested in creating a sci-fi legend exclusively for the gaming space. Devlin in particular was enthusiastic at the prospect of creating an interactive experience that wasn't hamstrung by a connection to a movie or other existing media. The result was the 10th Planet. Headed by an RPG Game of the Year winner, a sci-fi film power duo, and with a release date set for the holiday season of 1996, this was surely to be a momentous title. 4 missed release dates and a book release later, this never came to be. In 1999, the game was shelved. While never officially cancelled, it was surely dead. Until that is, we were introduced to a trailer from a brand new IP.
Starfield is a game that we have spent years thinking about and working on.
We have you on scanners. Helium-3 tanks checked. Seals are intact.
What you found, it's the key to unlocking everything.
A round patch with 10 heavenly bodies and the words, the 10th Planet. Is this just a kind gesture to a forgotten project? Or is it more than that? Is Starfield the spiritual successor to a dead game? We'll be investigating that and more as we discover what the 10th Planet was and what caused it to spin out of control through development hell before crash landing onto the cutting room floor. Grab some snacks and get comfortable as we prepare to experience the story of the space epic that flew so close, but never close enough.
Jwlar.
What was the 10th Planet? From how it played to its aesthetic design and the story behind it. Well, that is a multifaceted question because this game wasn't just one game. It morphed over time. As we've seen with Arena, this isn't uncommon for 90s Bethesda, or with game development in general, with a 4-year development hell of shifting priorities and a change of team members. The 10th Planet evolved more than most. Over this 4-year period, we can boil it down to 3 distinct versions. The original version started production in 1995 and set to release in 96. It even has its own self-running demo. This is the only footage we have of the 10th Planet actually running. It was set to release shortly after Daggerfall, hence the demo being supplied alongside a playable demo for that second entry into the Elder Scrolls. Clearly, this was Bethesda's answer to TIE Fighter. Rather than the sweeping, procedurally generated lands of Bethesda's open world games, the 10th Planet was explicitly a space combat simulator with a focus on action. It was advertised on both Centropolis's and Bethesda's websites, where interestingly they share very similar layouts. Note that the Bethesda archive is younger and already has an updated release date in 1997. Centropolis Entertainment, creators of such Hollywood hit films as Moon 44, Universal Soldier and Stargate, have partnered with Bethesda to create one of the most exciting science fiction adventures ever created. An original science fiction story about the discovery of a distant planet within our solar system that is determined to have been the cause of numerous natural disasters in ancient Earth history. Only there was nothing natural about them. There isn't a lot of insight into the game here, but we can envision the overarching premise, and that the name is a reference to a hidden planet. The concept of a newly discovered 10th planet is nothing new. It was explored by sci-fi authors such as Edmund Cooper with 1978's titular The 10th Planet, and before that being the setting for the final few episodes of William Hartnell's original Doctor Who run back in 1966. Known as Mondas, it was the home of the infamous Who villain, the Cybermen. The proposal of an unknown 10th planet wasn't as unbelievable in the 20th century. The 9th planet of the Sol system, Pluto, was discovered in 1930. As you know, a certain reclassification by the International Astronomical Union in 2006 turned Pluto into a dwarf planet, now nullifying the 10th planet's qualification as, well, the 10th planet. The self-running demo was presented to journalists at that year's E3 convention. The popular print publications of the time were thoroughly impressed with what they saw. PC Gamer fawned over the state-of-the-art graphics, made ultra-realistic by some truly remarkable lighting effects. A relevant observation given that the demo is equivalent to, if not a bit more advanced than TIE Fighter, released the year before. GamePro UK made sure to mention that the boys at Bethesda were keeping their cards pretty close to their chest with this one. The game was said to be a shoot-'em-up, where you have complete freedom of movement. It's a kind of Star Fox beats X-Wing, with some of the finest graphics we've seen for a long while. They confidently report that the game should be out in early '96, and that there were possible Saturn and PlayStation versions of the 10th Planet hitting stores later in the year. Another piece of the puzzle. The fabled console ports that Bethesda were keen to release, yet none of them ever came to fruition until Morrowind half a decade later. PC Zone were the most excited for the game. Connor McNicholas's use of a goofy writing style harks back to a time sorely missed from game journalism. McNicholas records his visit to Bethesda's office from the point of view of a nationalistic American spy, including jabs at Bethesda's choice to hire Danish programmers, and a call to action for the reader to eat this page at the end of the briefing. Contained within this dramatic literature, we can find extensive knowledge of this early version. There are almost no restrictions. You can fly away from the space station until it is only a tiny speck in the starry backdrop, or swoop into the station's own docking bay to launch a surprise attack. While the game was an open world, it was still aiming to be large in scope. With flashbacks to Arena's troubled development, McNicholas notes that the game will be online, allowing players to dogfight each other over a network. The vastness of space possibly had something to do with procedural generation too, not surprising given that this was their wheelhouse in the late 90s. It was Bethesda's newly developed proprietary engine that excited journalists the most, specifically with how it displayed 3D graphics. The textures wouldn't tear or warp based on your position, a limitation often seen affecting the 3D games of the original PlayStation. We can use 1994's Wing Commander 3 as an example of how these visual issues affected other 3D space games on the PC, a problem that the 10th Planet was said to be free of. The team behind this early version is not well documented, past the obvious mentions of the Centropolis duo alongside Bethesda president Chris Weaver. Weaver is credited as an executive producer on most titles released by the studio before his departure, but was admittedly rarely involved with the game design itself. There is only one mention of another developer working on this early version, from a preview website, The Computer Show, an extensive game release database active from 1995 to 2006. It isn't the most trustworthy of sources, with this gorgeous home screen saying as much. Nevertheless, it names the lead programmer as Kor Seizing. Seizing did work at Bethesda, with credits on the Terminator titles and Delta V, so this may be true. However, it wasn't until the later developed 1997 version where we are introduced to an actual game designer, and it was one of the best, ex-TSR creative designer Bruce Nesmith. It is with this second version of the game where we can discover much more. With how little press the earlier version garnered relative to this later one, it seems likely that the original release date was preliminary at best, especially considering that that version was a shadow of what it was developing into. Now at the helm of the project, new Bethesda hire Bruce Nesmith was a legend in the pen and paper RPG world. He had worked at the then Dungeons & Dragons rights holders, designing the Ravenloft campaign setting, Dragonstrike board game, and the 4th edition of D&D. Needless to say, he was one of the most experienced writers in the role-playing community, and was recruited to help with Daggerfall as well as spearhead future games at Bethesda. A lot of the press revolved around the X engine. The technology had impressed gamers in Terminator Future Shock, and Bethesda were seeking to double down, marketing the engine extensively. In a comprehensive interview with Next Generation magazine, Nesmith discussed his plans for the 10th planet now that he was at the helm. He curiously mentioned that the 10th planet wasn't running the original X engine, but instead a new version. This appears to be a creation engine situation, where fundamentally that engine is still Gamebryo at its core, with tons of improvements built on top of it. Nesmith was likely vocalizing the distinction to help inform readers that the 10th planet will be technologically superior to Daggerfall and Future Shock, despite it running on the same tech. The new version of the X engine was touted to be running a Phong-based lighting model. Although it did later become an industry standard, this type of lighting only entered general usage in 1999 with Sega's Hikaru arcade system. Most home hardware was not capable of running it, partially due to it rendering diffuse, ambient and specular shading on a pixel-by-pixel basis. Competitor LucasArts used the less realistic, but also less graphically intensive, Goro shading. It wasn't until Doom 3 that a scaled-down version of Phong shading was successfully introduced to home PC gaming. To put it into perspective, this version of the 10th planet was planned for a September 1997 release, 7 years prior. Next Generation does make it clear that even with this lighting model, the X engine maintains such a high frame rate through any number of resolutions that when the game was demoed, the graphics adapter in the PC dropped frames well before the engine slowed. The engine is impressive, but there is the issue. The engine may have been able to handle the fidelity, but the PC components at the time could not. This is not the only reason for the delays, but overconfidence is a common feature of troubled game developments, and an obstacle that often leads to greater difficulties. Take Nesmith's comments on the X engine's ahead of its time achievements as an example. He wasn't too concerned with optimization, as it wasn't his responsibility. It was up to the programmers to make it work, and who knows how optimistic Nesmith was here in regards to the reality. Concerning Centropolis Entertainment's involvement, Dean Devlin has been excited for a long time about getting his hands dirty. He recognizes that he doesn't have the knowledge to create his own game, but he does know how to tell stories and how to recognize good special effects. The two companies had good rapport. Jeff Goldblum's character in Independence Day is said to have been inspired by Christopher Weaver.
And apparently Chris Weaver was the inspiration for the guy who uploaded the virus.
Devlin's expertise mostly came in writing and offering advice for the effects. It's his involvement with the writing that became a problem. Devlin's a busy guy, and some of the delays to the 10th planet have been directly related to the fact that Centropolis was up to its eyeballs in work for Independence Day. Maybe we didn't like that, but there wasn't much we could do about it. These guys were going to earn $100 million on this movie. Bethesda? Well, we kind of weren't in the driver's seat on that. So we have decent confirmation for why the 1996 release date was missed. On Bethesda's end, they seem to be doing well. The game impressed at E3, and a self-running demo was released with an admirable frame rate and fair graphics. But the narrative wasn't ready. Bethesda were left sitting on their hands, waiting for Devlin. Which leads us to development hell. A key aspect that results in overhyped games like Duke Nukem Forever spending an unfathomable number of years in development is feature creep. As release dates are missed, technology advances and gamers expect more. What looked good 1 year would be dated 2 years down the line, markedly more so in the late 90s, with graphical fidelity advancing at breakneck speeds. We can compare Bethesda's own Daggerfall to Red God to see the rapid progression in just 2 years. Every time Devlin was late, Bethesda would have to update the engine. 1 year it may be Phong lighting, the next high poly models. Each delay leads to more work as the developers play catch up in trying to release a game that journalists have already called state of the art. Nesmith had used this extra time to take the game from a basic combat simulator to something more expected from such a lengthy development. The 10th planet was now to be a war game, combined with a space sim, where our solar system's planetary orbits have an effect on the game's strategic elements. Such descriptions bring up visions of galactic strategy games like Master of Orion or Armada 2525. Instead of battles being automatic, they are fought by the player in the combat sim part of the game, akin in some regards to the much later released Star Wars Battlefront 2 and its Galactic Conquest game mode. Allusions to massive multiple fleet battles within a faithfully rendered solar system of over 80 different planets and moons conjures images of a game far grander than anything seen before. The mention of 80 orbiting planets comes as unexpected. Before this, all assumptions were that the game would cover our solar system only. Using scientific data from NASA, the 10th Planet team were accurately modelling the planets, moons and constellations with 84 points of interest, representing actual locations in the Milky Way galaxy. The 10th Planet was now a large-scale strategy game and a flight simulator. It doesn't end there though. There was going to be a third key section, personalised shipbuilding. Now that sounds familiar. With plans featuring 85 different pieces of equipment you can apply to 5 different ships, with your ship's upgrades and gadgetry being dependent on your rank, ranging from cadet to captain. That even sounds like there was going to be some degree of a level up or promotion system as the player advanced through the game, adding a thin veneer of RPG design. Further alluding to my theory of the 10th planet being a basis for Starfield is that these RPG elements could have been deeper than just a leveling system, and it came from the mouth of Bethesda's own lead game designer, Emil Paglarulo. Emil once had more humble beginnings as a games journalist, writing for an online publication, The Adrenaline Vault. He met Bethesda at E3, subsequently writing a gushing article for the upcoming space sim. According to Emil, we could expect the game to have the trademark Bethesda role-playing feel. At this time, Bethesda's trademark RPG feel was Daggerfall, so these were not to be simplified mechanics, but something closer to the intricacies of tabletop role-playing. Regarding the strategy elements, Emil compares them to XCOM, with a need to research and develop advanced alien technologies and build and manage bases. The recent Starfield Direct's focus on base building seems to have its beginnings further back than just Fallout 4. PC Gamer saw Nesmith lay out his design plan for the 3 major elements, each included to make the game stand out in the genre. The bread and butter portion is the actual 3D spaceship combat. Our major advantage here is that we can build far more detailed environments. We will have huge space stations to fly through that include moving parts and 3D asteroids circling around. We can have dozens of ships in combat simultaneously. The game will include the ground terrains of all the moons and planets in the solar system. The second element is the ship construction, including engines, thrusters, shield generators, weapons, computers, and more. We believe that gamers really like tinkering with their ships. The third and most important element of the game is the strategy portion. Typically, space combat games have been mission-based. The player runs the missions in the order the designer made them, which is the traditional adventure game setup. Basically, the player is playing out the story written by the designer. Replay value is nil. In contrast, strategy games have very high replay value. Where the player goes and what he does are completely up to him. From descriptions alone, the 10th Planet was shaping up to be one of the most exciting space games released at the time. Further extrapolating on these strategy elements with CNET, Nesmith detailed them as less freeform than a 4X style game, instead closer to, and stay with me here, Call of Duty, specifically 2016's entry, Infinite Warfare. I don't blame you if you haven't played it, but if you have, you will know that in a departure from the norm, the campaign was played like a choose-your-own adventure style novel. Missions could be completed in any order, and the story's pacing and resolutions would be determined by your decisions. The CNET article confirmed the strategic scenario you choose is up to you, though it will affect your path through the game. This approach ensures varied gameplay as players pick and choose very different scenarios, ranging from all-out attacks on battle cruisers to escorting freighters and defending distant outposts. Similar to Total War, the strategy mode would be reflected within the combat. In Rome Total War, the location where two armies meet on the world map is reflected in the battle map, with rivers, mountains and more being accurately placed in the RTS part of the game, allowing strategic planning around river crossings and the like to offer a distinct advantage to the player. Nesmith wanted to implement a similar feature 3 years prior to the first Total War game even being released. The more we read these interviews, the more we can realise that the dev team were biting off more than they could chew. It reminds one of Peter Molyneux exaggerating his games during their marketing campaigns, or, more fittingly, Todd Howard's all too charming fanfare for features that are frankly not as exciting as he was making them out to be.
Who's laughing now?
After all of these new features purported for the 1997 version of the game, how else could Bethesda make this game even more impossible to make? Well, how about changing the locations of the human and alien bases randomly on each new game to add endless replayability, as well as altering the positions of the planets and the asteroid belts? Over-ambition is evidently a problem with 90s Bethesda. I don't want to blame Nesmith here, but my belief is that his background at TSR may be part of the issue. Coming from a pen and paper landscape, you need not worry about technology or what can be done. Your imagination is the limit. That isn't the case with a video game. Time, budget, technology, programming knowledge, and more are all limiting factors that can lead to a game missing release dates. The promises of grand new features came with each new interview, month after month as the deadline approached. By June, Nesmith had made plans for resource management too. According to Nesmith, this would create a variety of intriguing submissions. The issue is that Nesmith was speaking about what he wanted the game to have, not what it had working. Space combat is all we have seen. A lot of these other elements existed only on paper. Nesmith himself was aware of this. If everything turns out perfect, then I'll have access to some really cool technologies that nobody else does. There's a high probability that we can have fractal landscapes, which means we can have players fly over the surface of any moon or any planet, and we won't have to manually create the data beforehand. We also have some interesting tricks we can use to put a lot of ships in the sky, and I don't know how many a lot is right now, but I'm confident we can put in 2 to 3 times as many as anyone else. The planets that we are supposed to have been able to fly around only existed in a design document, as did the massive battles. This interview was from February, whereas his far more confident statements in PC Gamer came in September, so it is possible that they implemented these technologies. Gamers, however, never saw any proof of it. It is important to remember that Nesmith was marketing the game. As project lead, he was taking these interviews to garner hype, which is why we need to take all of his statements with a grain of salt. Which takes us back to Nesmith coming from pen and paper. It's one thing to design these features, but it's an entirely different endeavor to implement them into an interactive medium, especially when Nesmith claimed, in September mind you, that we could expect the game to be out plenty of time before the holiday season. Remember that this game was last mentioned in 1999 and never released. Not all journalists were blind to the overhyping and wild claims of how advanced the game would be. CNET led their article with the apparent goal of calming people's expectations. If you think of games that have been overhyped for no good reason, Bethesda's 10th Planet is near the top of the list. This was to be the third time I had seen it since the first E3 2 years ago. Previous unveilings amounted to a ship taking potshots at asteroids to show off Bethesda's 3D X engine. That's the most valid of criticism possible, then and now. For all these interviews and promises of exciting features, all the gaming audience had seen is that original 1996 demo, and screenshots that don't show much more. The article's journalist, Bill Mayer, didn't receive the most promising of welcomes at the Rockville-based studio either. His pragmatism is a breath of fresh air, but even he was eventually won over by Bethesda. If only we had access to this 1997 demo. We need to see what Mayer saw to even fathom if there was a chance of this game coming to fruition. If this demo was ever released publicly, there is no longer any trace of it online, and without it we don't have any proof that what was mentioned in these publications was ever a reality, or just a bunch of what-ifs. The 1997 deadline came and went. There was still no 10th Planet. In 1998, publications covering Bethesda only mentioned Red God. The space sim that was all the rage a year prior was nowhere to be seen. After the release of that fourth Elder Scrolls game, not much had changed. There were only two sources for this final 1999 version of the game that I could find, one of them being the tie-in box series intended to coincide with the game. The 10th Planet may not be obviously related to the game of the same name until you see that the story was by Christopher Weaver. In the back of this book is an advertisement for the game, proclaiming yet another winter release alongside a new 3D model. 5 years after its first announcement, Bethesda continues to claim that we are moments away from the next revolution in computer games as we join the desperate fight for humanity. With unparalleled 3D graphics, lush cutscenes and intense action, the 1999 version is said to be a fast, furious action game based on this suspenseful science fiction book. Players will take to the skies as part of an elite strike force sent to save the Earth from the alien onslaught. There is no mention of the strategy elements from before, nor the ability to customize this futuristic spacecraft. Again, Bethesda boasts that they will be using the latest in 3D technology as they bring the epic struggle to our computer screen with exceptional graphics and detail. The need to be on the cutting edge, a curse bestowed onto the game from its first E3 showing, has forced Bethesda to ensure the game never fell behind the times. They were compelled to an endless development of feature creep to meet the expectations placed upon them. By missing this mark, no matter how good the game was underneath its aged visuals, it would never be able to escape the disappointment of the media and interested fans who were waiting for a game that was meant to be ahead of its time. The advantages Bethesda had with the X engine were no longer as impressive as they once were. Other developers had caught up, and worse, space games had come a long way too. 1998's Free Space The Great War wowed audiences with its high-res 3D models and explosive special effects that were greater than what the X engine was capable of. That's not to say that the X engine wasn't able to match what the competition were doing. X-Car Experimental Racing proved that it could still render cutting-edge visuals. However, graphical fidelity can only help so much when trying to sell a game. X-Car's harsh mechanics and 1997 release date had it competing with a myriad of famous franchises, where it was unable to successfully stand out. Bethesda may have been worried of a similar scenario hurting the 10th planet. When it was originally conceived, space combat sims were a popular niche. 5 years later, sales and interest in the genre had fallen considerably. The market was oversaturated, which may explain why the game was finally cancelled for its last time. There was no longer any interest. Book sales and pre-order numbers could be used to conclude if a release may be worth it, and the answer could have easily been no. The only other source for this 1999 version of the game is a Romanian magazine. Level covered the game extensively at a time when no other publication would dare. Even better, there is a bunch of new imagery that cannot be found anywhere else. The game still looks impressive against the competition, proving that despite the problems of feature creep, the team were able to keep up. These are only screenshots though. Whether the game could run at a stable and reasonable frame rate is another issue. Despite the buck foregoing any mention of them, we have confirmation here that the strategy and RPG elements were still involved, with mentions of various locales and visuals the player could have expected to see. From planets, satellites, orbital bases, meteors, comets, stars, and all kinds of ships, from huge battleships to small fighters. Comparisons are made to Origin's Wing Commander Privateer concerning the open-endedness and replayability of the game. In that game, the player could choose the life of a pirate, merchant, or mercenary, playing as a free agent able to explore a vast universe with countless bases and planets spread out across dozens of systems. It's unclear whether this comparison is a means of explaining how the game was planned to be non-linear, or an example of how, once again, the game had grown to now include multiple career choices. Questions do arise. Why is this the only magazine we can find mentioning this later version of the game? And how credible is this new information? If it wasn't for the new screenshots, I would have assumed that the article was a rehash of the previous 1997 ones, but they must have had access to some form of press pack to acquire these. And if there was a press pack, why is this the only publication that used it? Is it possible that magazines chose to ignore this final push to release the game? A kind of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me scenario? American publications had already been burnt twice reporting on the 10th planet. We can't blame them for not believing Bethesda on this 1999 release date. They were right to think this, of course. There is a possibility that some covered the game but were not archived. Having said this though, the most prominent ones, the publications that had previously clambered over the game, such as PC Gamer, made no mention of it whatsoever. Hi, this is Jwlar, and today I welcome you to my hearsay Trust Me Bro extravaganza. In today's episode, we have the claim that there was a fourth version of the 10th planet, developed outside of Bethesda Softworks by UK game developer Simis. Later rebranded to Kuju, this small team is speculated to have been working on their own version of the 10th planet in 1998. Bethesda was to publish the title before this UK-led game was also cancelled. Why would Bethesda choose this small UK-based company then? Because they were already working on their own game, Xenocracy, for which they had a working engine. Indeed, Xenocracy's free-flowing gameplay, strategic solar system map, and first-person space sim combat is very reminiscent of the planned 1997 version of the 10th planet. It even had a PlayStation 1 port. Is this a possible rebrand of what could have been that game? Coming from a tertiary source, this should be taken with the biggest grain of salt possible. All of this speculation is based on a random comment found on a blog discussing the 10th planet's cancellation. I did reach out to the commenter, but the chances of them logging into this blog site 7 years later is slim. Up to this point, the involvement from Centropolis hasn't been too obvious. That is because Dean Devlin's importance to the development came mostly with writing. While there were 3 confirmed versions of the game, there are only 2 plotlines. The original Devlin penned one, and another by Bethesda president Christopher Weaver. Centropolis' version, or lack thereof, is the reason behind the original delay of the 1996 version of the game. They did have a good reason for the distraction. The story began as you would expect, based on the premise that we are not alone in our solar system. Beyond Pluto, there exists a hidden planet, on which lives a civilization of beings more advanced and warlike than that of Earth. They have lain dormant for 1,000 years, but in the near future of the 2100s, it is time for them to awaken. Our new neighbours aren't too happy to find humanity extending our reach throughout the solar system. The 10th planet has already laid claim to the other planets, and are preparing to retaliate against this perceived aggression. They express their immense displeasure by obliterating Earth's defenseless research base on Pluto. Yesterday, we were alone in the galaxy. Today, we are at war. The original intention behind the collaboration was to combine the gaming expertise of Bethesda with the cinematic vision of Centropolis. Based on this plot outline, it's difficult to see what the experienced Hollywood duo were bringing to the project. It isn't exactly groundbreaking stuff. Bruce Nesmith explained how the story would play out within the game, starting with the beings from the 10th planet invading our solar system, destroying the Plutonian research base, leaving the player character as the only survivor. As the game progresses, the aliens would spread throughout the solar system, attacking human bases and stations and setting up their own. The player would need to fight them in hopes of saving Earth, with the simultaneous goal of discovering the aliens' mysterious motive. To the dismay of the designers at Bethesda, Devlin wanted to be more involved than a simple scriptwriter too. He wanted to supply design ideas and more.
Can you talk about how that came to be / how it came not to be?
It's such a clown show. Dean Devlin was probably the one who was most at our offices. They had come to Chris Weaver and said, hey, we are geniuses about making up worlds, and we will help you out and do these things. So they were working on Stargate at the time, and Stargate came out and did very well, and they said, look, we're really smart, and we will make games with our genius.
According to Peterson, Devlin's main idea was repurposed from Stargate. The Egyptian pyramids of that universe are made by aliens. In the 10th planet, it was to be the Aztec pyramids of Central and Southern America built by the Little Green Men.
They had like Aztec alien spacecrafts that they had designed.
What did they look like?
Like a Lego. They were not fabulous.
Disparity between business partners is never a good thing. If Bethesda were reluctant to use Devlin's ideas, as is implied here, it helps explain the rocky development of the game quite well. Despite these woes from Bethesda's design team, Devlin was enthusiastic for the game and did show an understanding of how to approach an interactive medium differently to that of a motion picture. Centropolis' involvement may not be necessary from a design standpoint. Their ideas are derivative at best, but the partnership does seem to have been sincere. It's difficult to boil down exactly when the partnership broke down. We can confirm that it was before 1999, as Chris Weaver took the basic story outline and warped it into his own creation in the form of a book release. A theory behind this book is that after Centropolis departed the project, if Bethesda still planned to release the game, they would need to remove Devlin's ideas, else risk the threat of copyright infringement. To save this sinking ship, Weaver took the basic non-copyrightable ideas, a hidden planet, an alien invasion, and approached prolific sci-fi writer Dean Wesley Smith to write a new storyline, releasing this story as a book. The copyright now belonged to Weaver. It's also likely that the book itself was an attempt to recoup a small portion of the financial losses that the lengthy game development had incurred. That said, sales of the book weren't particularly high. In preparation for this video, I purchased and read a copy of this obscure novel. The book itself is a fun, quick read, very pulpy and not particularly memorable, certainly not groundbreaking stuff, but it was enjoyable enough. Instead of an advanced future where mankind has spread across the solar system, the story starts in 2017, then 18 years in the future. Humanity's advancements align well with our own. There aren't any smartphones, instead we all use smart watches, complete with video calls and online capabilities. In search of greater knowledge, NASA is sending probes to photograph our galaxy and deep space. One of these innocent machines, ISMB-6, is orbiting Uranus and maintaining its standard protocol when it suddenly stops reporting to Earth. It was perfectly functional just moments before, but in a flash of light, it was gone. In an attempt to investigate what has happened, astronomers repositioned the Hubble telescopes to take a closer look. It picks up a startling image, a planet-sized foreign body travelling towards Earth on a curved trajectory. They don't know what the strange object is, only that by their calculations, it orbits near Earth every 2 millennia. Meanwhile, an archaeologist has discovered peculiar layers of black residue at dig sites across the globe. Stranger still, these thin bands occur every 2006 years, coinciding with some of the world's darkest moments in history. The maths are done. In approximately 6 months, the 10th planet will orbit past Earth, and we must prepare for its arrival. One can't help but notice the ironic similarities to Independence Day. Weaver's attempt to remove correlations with Stargate and other remaining Centropolis copyright issues has resulted in a recreation of their most infamous release. There are 2 more books in the series that tie up the story. The result is a Pyrrhic victory for Earth, as the 10th planet is all but destroyed as it continues on its broad orbit. Book 2, ironically titled Oblivion, has Earth sending its intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles directly at the 10th planet's surface. Their air defenses successfully prevent an Armageddon, but the aliens are badly wounded. The 3rd book sees Earth mount a final assault, using all of the capable spacebound technology at our disposal, including even the iconic space shuttle. The trilogy's relation to the game seems to be mostly in the broad sense. The invasion is an uncomplicated premise for which the player character has a reason to dogfight aliens. The 1999 Level article confirmed that the strategy elements still existed, but it's tough to envision how they could with this altered plotline. Mankind isn't advanced in this story. There is no human presence on other planets, only our moon. The only space base humanity possesses is the ISS, and we are woefully behind the enemy technologically, and all the conflicts occur near the surface of our 2 planets. There is no mention of the 80 planets and locales planned for the 1997 version. If the strategy elements did exist, perhaps they were akin to those in XCOM. Cities could be attacked and the player must rush their team of pilots there to defend the invasion. Another possibility is that the Level magazine was wrong. The advertisement in the back of the 10th Planet book alludes to a game focused on high-G dogfighting above the Earth's surface. Again, closer to Independence Day than to Star Wars. The plot outlined in that article does not align well with Weaver's books either, rehashing the old Dean Devlin premise instead. If the 1999 version of the game was to be a generic flight combat sim, I can't blame Bethesda for cancelling the game outright. After all of the hype made for a frankly superior idea in 1997, there is no way gamers would have been happy with the final lackluster product. A game that had the promise of being one of the most exciting space games of the late 90s ended as a whimper in the back of a mediocre science fiction novel. It's time to ask, what went wrong? As is often the case with these stories, there isn't one single reason for the delays and eventual cancellation. It was a multitude of smaller problems that when combined together would kill the 10th planet. The first being the partnership between a growing video game developer and a Hollywood production firm on the verge of massive breakout success.
They went off to work on Independence Day. I don't blame them for like, hey, let's not work with this mom and pop shop and let's go do this huge movie, because they were small and they got big very quickly.
With the release of Independence Day, it was only a matter of time until this small side project was abandoned by Centropolis. As they moved on to Godzilla for their next project, they could no longer invest the time needed to work on a relatively insignificant video game. This split was on good terms, to the point that Bethesda swore that it wouldn't impact the development of the game, claiming that they had reached the home stretch. They will definitely get the game out before Christmas. Bethesda had been going from strength to strength leading into 1997. On the up and up, Bethesda reinvested into itself, hiring staff and greenlighting a number of ambitious projects. Battlespire, Red God, XCOR, and the 10th Planet all entered production simultaneously. To accompany this bright future, a new slogan championed by the then director of marketing stated, "The more you play with us, the bigger we get." Unfortunately, the premise of exciting, high-selling games didn't happen. Bethesda was too big. The unsustainable growth became just that. The reliance on their new games being a success left the company floundering as each one flopped harder than the next. Combined with the rapid growth, Bethesda had become reckless with their cash reserves, blowing capital on unnecessary expenditure. One such purchase being the 3D motion graphics agency XL Translab. They were originally hired to create high-quality cinematic cutscenes for the 10th Planet's story, before being purchased outright. It was the XL Translab team who created the cutscenes seen in Red God. A former Bethesda employee recalled the cinematics being beautiful for their time, but the high expense behind their production made the X-Engine based gameplay look ugly in comparison. How on earth were the game artists supposed to recreate the world they were selling? Too much time and money was wasted on that trailer. The expectations were too great. The game could never match these rendered visuals. High expectations weren't just from that trailer. Nesmith had already hyped the product to insurmountable levels with his ill-fated press run. In 1996, they only had space combat working. Now they were expected to have a strategy game, ship customization, battles between hundreds of fighters, and rendered planet surfaces to fly past. It was too much to ask for in a single year. Heck, it's taken Starfield 8 years.
You are never judged by the actual work you do. You are judged against the expectation, managing expectations. If I make a game, the expectation is here. If my 10-year-old cousin makes a game, the expectation is here. If he meets that expectation, he is praised. If I fail this expectation, but I make here, I am vilified. But my game is objectively better than his, but I failed to make expectations.
Had the 10th Planet released, it would have possibly been a Fallout 76 scenario for Bethesda, only 20 years prior. Releasing a buggy game that didn't match what was promised. Patches may fix the bugs, but the goodwill would already have been lost. These events would have resulted in another commercial disaster amidst Bethesda's bad run in the late 90s. Knowing that then, perhaps cancelling the game was for the best. You wouldn't think a forgotten game that was never released would have much influence, yet the 10th Planet continues to surprise. Of course, we have the direct consequence of this chance partnership between Bethesda and Centropolis. If you had to pick someone to save the planet, Chris Weaver likely wouldn't be your first choice. Yet the multiple PhD holder did just that as a consultant for Independence Day. Jeff Goldblum's David Levinson, whose technical wizardry miraculously managed to save the world, was apparently based on Weaver's knowledge of futuristic technology.
What? Which part?
Then there are those tenuous links to Bethesda's new IP, 25 years in the making. Is this trailer referencing the 10th planet? With bases, ship customization, space sim elements, and of course dogfighting, the links are there. Starfield may indeed have been 25 years in the making, albeit in a more poetic sense. Todd Howard has said that his team knew they wanted to make a space-oriented science fiction game eventually. They even had the opportunity on multiple occasions. Believe it or not, Bethesda long ago had the rights to Traveller when I first started in 1994. There's a game we put out called Delta V that was part of this Traveller game. It ended up not really going anywhere. There was going to be a space game called The 10th Planet in 1997. We actually had the Star Trek rights at one point and made some games in the 2000s. It's a throwaway line among other space titles, but it is confirmation that, at least to some minor degree, the 10th Planet did play a part in Starfield's design. It's the non-linear style of gameplay, where the player is free to choose what they want to do, where the two shall share the most in common. With its costly development and poor sales hurting every Bethesda game after 1996, the longest lasting influence of the 10th Planet is how it played a factor in a pivotal point in Bethesda Softworks' history. In financial trouble, Christopher Weaver was forced to raise funds. He made a deal with Robert A. Altman, who would buy a leading share in Bethesda through new parent company ZeniMax Media. Most projects at Bethesda were cancelled, the 10th Planet being among them. What staff and resources remained were funneled into Morrowind, their last-ditch effort to save the company. Howard recalled that time as not just being about getting Morrowind done, it was the recreation of Bethesda itself. They were rebuilding from the bottom, with a key question: what kind of development team do we want to be? Despite all that had happened between them, the 10th Planet's troubled development didn't sour Dean Devlin's partnership with Bethesda. He became an advisor for ZeniMax Media from 1999 to 2004, possibly alluding to an attempt to save the game. For Weaver though, ZeniMax spelt his end. In 2002, he was pushed out of a leading role at the company, relinquishing all control on the company he had founded over a decade earlier. Duke Nukem Forever, Alien Colonial Marines, Prey, Dead Island 2. Development hell doesn't guarantee a bad game, but at least those examples saw the light of day. The 10th Planet remains lost to time. It may have been a groundbreaking release years ahead of its time, or a disaster that sank the developer now heading its spiritual successor. If there is one lesson to take away, it's that expectations are the roots of disappointment. Whether that be a game never coming to fruition or it releasing below the perceived hype around it. When we look to Starfield, knowing the history of this abandoned project from 25 years prior, it may be wise to enter that new universe with a level head and our feet firmly on the ground. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.